everybody, Glenn Curry here, back at the H2O studio here, overlooking Public Square. We're with Josh Todd and Alex Hammond. We're talking about the St. Lawrence River, and we talked in depth about fishing and all the new tournaments that are coming up to the region, and the fact that the bass are bigger these days, and the announcement from Abu Garcia claiming, at least, that St. Lawrence has the best fishing in the country, and that's a big claim in itself, and we're very proud to have heard that. Couple of Round Island, Frontenac Island. So it's the island with two names, Josh. Which is it? Is it Round Island or Frontenac?
Right now it goes by Round Island, but the Frontenac post office is still current, still delivering mail. So island residents can go pick up their mail there too. But yeah, it's been born of a couple names.
It's got its own post office there. Where exactly is Round Island?
So it's right northeast of Clayton and just a little bit downriver. So there's a little round island just north of it, and Round Island is not round at all. It's more cigar-shaped, if anything, but it was named Frontenac for the hotel that was built there, too.
Now, we did a little research. The actual hotel was built in 1899, was only stood standing there in Frontenac, or Round Island, for 12 years. It burned down in 1911, like so many other wood structures. So let's first start off by asking the question, did they know the ramifications of building a wood structure and on the St. Lawrence River, that if anything did go wrong, they wouldn't have the ability to put it out? They certainly didn't have any means to do so. That
building inspector that had a 4th grade education said, we're surrounded by water, so let's just build everything with wood. We've got nothing to worry about. But, I mean, as far as hotels and structures burning down, it went from the Frontenac to the Hubbard House to the Calumet Castle, Thousand Islands Park, River Edge Resort, Hub House on Hub Island, right. Grindstone House, and the Columbia Hotel.
And it might be something that, is taken for granted today, but probably because of the heating sources they had to use back then. At the turn of the century, you're still using, I'm guessing, fireplaces, wood stoves, coal, kerosene, to heat these large, huge places that I'm sure had horrible insulation.
Right.
Somebody's staying up stoking the fireplace.
Right.
With the Frontenac Hotel specifically, burned down by the use of a cigarette. And a strange irony, which we'll get to later, but yeah, they all have succumbed to fire at some point, and it's...
He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. Just like we heard the famous story, and we'll get, like you said, Josh, we'll get to that. But the St. Lawrence, the history of all the hotels, and not to mention the actual railroad systems that came out of New York, Rome-Watertown famous, that was built before the Civil War. And it just indicated that despite the fact that the weather was no different than it is today, and we didn't have the means to have air conditioning or heating like we do today, but a lot of people came up here because of the lumber industry and what eventually became the paper industry. So there were a lot of people here that were taking advantage of this newfound land in northern New York. We had a lot of people from New York City that came up here because they not only were exploring the Adirondacks, as we know, but they were also exploring the river. And within that context, guys like George Boldt, guys like Emery, like you mentioned before, they saw opportunities because they saw all this beautiful nature. They probably bought these islands for pennies on the dollar, but they realized because of the railroad system that there was a means to bring up people up here so they can enjoy it. So that was started, the railroad started up here in 1856, if I'm not mistaken, before the Civil War, if you can think of that, and then branched out into other areas, including Clayton, Cape Vincent, and Alex Bay. So now, all of a sudden, you didn't have automobiles, of course, you didn't even have electricity, but you had a lot of people that were able to come up from downstate and other areas of the country to come up here. We certainly should see a lot more of that, Josh, because we talked in our first episode, as if you're going to get a lot of people and exposure up here, you're going to have accommodations as well. Is that correct?
Correct. And the allure doesn't disappear. That's the crazy part about the river. It's been on people's psyche since the beginning of time, and since Columbus came across here, and we could chew that apart if we want to. But
sure.
They've had portages from the eastern side of Lake Ontario and Chameau Bay all the way to Clayton, and that's where the terminus for the railroads was there too. And I've seen pictures of ladies in their fancy dresses and men in top hats just vacationing. They'll get on a train in New York City and they'll head up here. I think they would stop off in Utica. There's still some nice trains down in Utica too, but there was a draw here, and they would recreate up here, and it was just where they would spend their summertime. And they had the money to do it. Like you said, they bought islands for very cheap, and some guys would scoop them all up at 10, 15 at a time, and then start doling them out to the people that he knew as buddies. And the interesting part is it's like the oil tycoons and the Rockefellers and the turn of the century people like for George Boldt, and even down to the Singer Castle owner for the Singer sewing machines.
Exactly.
The money was here, And as we talked about in the last episode, that even if you weren't affluent, you could come and enjoy the river on your skiff or on your canoe and fish and mess around in all the wallows that the rich people got. You just couldn't belly up to their boats and maybe enjoy the same food and wine that they had, but you're on the same location and enjoying the same spot. So it's got a lot of history, and I don't think that'll ever go away.
No, it isn't. I mean, you go into Clayton right now, you go to O'Brien's, you see a cross-section of a lot of people that represent a lot of socioeconomic backgrounds, that's for sure. One island that I'm fascinated with that we didn't talk about, guys, I'll bring up right now, is Carlton Island.
Yes,
and there's a big home there that fell, the owner of which probably lost his fortune like so many other people after the Depression. So you see this beautiful structure. It had its own ballroom on the 3rd floor. It had the old-fashioned toilets like from The Godfather, where you could still see that. At least you could. A couple of years ago. It's in disrepair now for obvious reasons. It's succumbed to the elements. But there's an example of where this guy had a dream. He had the money and resources to transport all that lumber. So that he had succumbed to poverty, unfortunately, after the fall of the stock market in 1929, like so many other people did. Was that the beginning of the end of the St. Lawrence heydays, Josh? From what you know,
I think it's just like the river that ever runs through. It's just another rebirth. It's just out with the old, in with the new. But the new will carry on traditions of the old. And Carlton Island, I don't know if you are aware of at the head of the island they have Fort Haldimand, and that's got a lot of history back to the 1812 War of 1812. As far as my research and everything I can find, that was the only land that changed hands during the War of 1812 with the British and the French and everyone competing for this area.
Wow.
So, a lot of history on that. They've been exploring that area at the head of the island, an old fortified structure there, and they've done ground penetrating radar. I mean, there's even talks of gold being lost there at one point, but there's some pretty famous figures that show up at Carlton Island specifically. But the history here is just so deep. It would take hours and hours to just break it all down and talk about all the connections that people have to the area.
But there's over 2,200 islands in the Thousand Islands, and they start from the opening right there at Cape Vincent and go all the way up the river. How far do the islands continue up through Waddington, Alex?
I mean, if you want to count the ones that we have, we've got Ogden Island. What's the other one?
Gallup.
Yes, that one's one. It's
Marshall.
One in Lisbon. Yep. And then we have one called Bird Island. It's a lot smaller now since the Seaway went through. But I mean, the islands continue. Where does the Thousand Islands end? I think that's where your imagination ends.
Ooh, I like that.
I still consider, us still part of the Thousand Islands.
Well, are there islands beyond the locks up towards Montreal? Do they have islands still in the middle?
Yes.
Okay, I've never been up in that region.
If you get on a boat and you have enough money to put fuel in your tank, you can head all the way out to Labrador and the Atlantic Ocean. So a couple locks along the way, but it's an open path to either the East Coast or right down through the center of the Great Lakes all the way up to Lake Superior. So it's well traveled. There's books and videos and series on it, and people just make the best of it. Either you're fishing or you're traveling through. So
let me ask you: the locks, does that prevent any of the salt water to come into the river at all? Is there any percentage of salt water in the St. Lawrence River at all?
I think it's just a brackish water out towards the coast, and then I don't think the locks prevent it. But once you open up to Labrador, and that's where Jacques Cartier came in, just by we're going a little bit farther back, but those are his two trips. Yeah, those are his two trips that came in through Labrador and up at the St. Lawrence. I think he made it as far as the Lachine Rapids. And met with some resistance because the water was so shallow. But that's where the Seaway Development Corp came in and made it to the Seaway that it is today. But
how long did it take to build the actual lock system?
Oh boy, 1959 I think is when they started.
It's 55 to 59. Yeah,
55 to 59.
About 4 years.
Yeah.
So it's amazing. I mean, the engineering spirit that Americans have. Not to mention we're off the beaten course here, but the Erie Canal was built and completed in 1825. If you could think of that, that's amazing. It was called Clinton's Ditch, and they started from Buffalo and then from Albany, and they kind of met in between. But that same engineering, obviously, years later, helped build the Panama Canal. Getting back to the islands, we talked about Frontenac, and we talked a little bit about Carlton Island. Let's go to the most famous island. I know it's probably the one story that a lot of people know a lot of, but there's a lot of people out there who don't know the story of Hart Island and George Boldt. It just one of those guys came over as an immigrant, like so many other people at the turn of the century or prior to the year 1900, with just pennies in his pocket from Hungary, and he built the big Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan. And then somehow or other, he learned about the Thousand Islands, fell in love with it, bought the Hard Island, and built the most famous castle in the Thousand Islands that went into disrepair. We all know the story. His wife died in 1904. That's when construction just completely stopped. But recently, they brought it back to life. Alex, let me ask you, what are your thoughts about the new and improved Boldt Castle in the last 10, 20 years?
It's amazing. You know, like the entire story from beginning to end. And then, you know, the end of that story would be, you know, 1977 when they actually, you know, bought it for $1, the Thousand Islands Bridge and Port Authority. And what's great about that is every single cent that they made in revenues goes back to actually restoring the mansion. And they don't want to build anything more, even though they have the plans. Mm-hmm. They just want to make sure that everything there is brought to life where it would have been. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great. I mean, you see I think what's awesome about it is every time you go to Boldt Castle, mm-hmm. you'll see something new because they're consistently always going to be doing work there. Mm-hmm. My grandparents tell me stories of when they used to go there, you know, in the 60s with a boat and just walk through there. Right. You know, just because it was the cool thing to do when you were a kid in the 60s. But now you can go there and you make a whole day out of it. With the different services you have for tours, you can hear about the stories we're talking about today with Bill Johnston and different mm-hmm. things like that, and take the whole tour that ends at Boldt Castle and going through the Boldt Castle tours. So I think it's great.
Weddings as well.
Oh my God.
Not to mention
the picturesque, just when you think Thousand Islands, mm-hmm. I think Boldt Castle.
Yeah. Not to mention the boathouse across the way, which amazingly has survived all this time because it's one big timber structure thank God that hasn't gone up.
Doesn't need to be heated, that's why.
Is that what it is? Yeah. But again, one of many structures on all the islands. But again, when you take one of the boat tours, either Uncle Sam boat tours from the Thompson family, those people, those young kids, a lot of them are college kids. They have to know a lot about history because they're going past Manhattan Island, where Abraham and Strauss from A&S Stores fame. I believe they were twin brothers. One was on the Titanic, the other one wasn't. Or mm-hmm. what? You hear all these things. So it's fascinating to know all that, and then they point over the edge of the boat and say, "Oh, we're going to cross over something really important here," and it's the international line, and everyone gets hoodwinked on that. So it's a great experience. But again, referring back to our first episode, tourism is key, mm-hmm. and we're getting tourists all over the world. A lot of Chinese nationalists are coming through here, and bus tours up from New York. They're doing the whole route through Thousand Islands over to Niagara Falls. So when they see something like Boldt Castle and they learn more about the history which we're talking about, that's the big key ingredient to bring them back here more and more. So again, a lot of that is happening right now. We talked about how fishing is going to bring a more prosperous future, but the history itself is something that should be reflected on. Unfortunately, I don't think of any movie that has ever taken place in the Thousand Islands that I can think of. But
I've got one of them.
Oh, what's that?
I've got a cameo.
Okay.
It was the Skulls. Yep, Skull and Bones. Yeah. So they use Singer Castle, which actually coincidentally is a castle I grew up on as a young man, mm-hmm. Before they opened it to the public. And my buddy's dad was a caretaker, so I would spend lots of summers out there on a castle that just was falling into disrepair again. They had some church services in the chapel, but it was Skulls or Skull and Bones. I can't remember
it's called Skulls.
Skulls, but it's touching on the Skull and Bones Society for Yale University. And in one of the shots, they have, I think it's Paul Walker. Is that the guy? Yeah. In a shot heading out towards Singer Castle. So
Paul Walker from Fast and Furious.
Guy,
the best part about that is the real one is in the Thousand Islands. Yes. Skull and Bones Society has a private island that they take their members to.
I want to say it's Pine Island. I'll have to look it up in the show notes. But
but it's cool that I think they were trying to use the actual island.
Right.
And then they couldn't get it, so they were like, well, they saw Singer Castle on their way to take the boat tour past the real one, and Singer Castle was like, yeah, sure. Why not?
And people were there was a family living in it up until I believe until the 80s on Singer Castle.
I did not know that.
Yes, it was Dr. Martin, and I think he was either dual citizenship or I can't remember the whole history, but yeah, and the caretakers have been there ever since, just maintaining it. There's a humongous generator system there that the actual Smithsonian wanted to get their hands on, and the owners were able to keep it there. But if you go paw around, and you'll see these big levers and the huge generator system, and boathouses have been restored. But yeah, I used to just barrel around that island and just hidden passageways before they were open
That's
to
what
the
they
public.
said,
Oh,
yeah.
it was great.
Have you ever seen the movie Me, Myself, and Irene?
It
Jim
takes
Carrey?
place in Messina.
Well, they talk about Messina, but I don't think they ever
I don't
actually
think they
filmed.
did.
But yeah, the main character there had hit a bald eagle in Messina, which is why she had to go to Messina, and that's why Jim Carrey's character had to actually take her.
Is that the
from
reason?
Rhode Island up
It's a
to-
goofy movie.
Yeah.
And the actual murder scene in the beginning where the two agents get killed in the motel takes place in Messina. And they go back to Rhode Island. I think most of it takes place in Providence, Rhode Island, which
right,
I think
right.
where the writer is originally from. But you know what? It just came to me. Fear No Evil was a movie that was made in the 70s, an answer to The Omen, Carrie, and The Exorcist, all those horror movies and
Right.
whatnot. But Fear No Evil, a director from the Rochester area, I believe, his family had property up here, and they loved Boldt Castle. And yes, he filmed a lot of the zombie scenes there. Now, it was about Lucifer, it was about the devil, and all that being born in. They actually shot scenes in DePaulville, one of the churches there, if you could believe that. It was a B movie. I don't know if you know that term, but today they'll call it like an independent or whichever. But it was cheaply made, but there were some actors and actresses that you might have recognized. But you know what? At the end of the day, it wasn't bad. But they showed Boldt Castle when it was in disrepair. That was done in the late 70s when, like you said, people could just literally walk on the island. And broken windows, graffiti all over the place. So when they went in there and fixed that, and like you said, they fix one room per year. So there's always something and then by the time they're done, they're going to have to go back to the beginning again.
And what I love about the restoration project that they do at Boldt Castle is just like if you've ever seen Pickens Hall in Hewelton, they leave some of the walls what they were before they actually, so you can actually see this is where it was, this is where we are now. And it's better, I like that better than just seeing photos of what it used to look like. They have the photos too, but it's cool to be able to see that's what it would look like if people hadn't come in and cared enough to refurbish,
to restore
this.
it.
Yeah.
The same thing with Grand Central Station in New York City. Jackie Onassis was very instrumental in saving that. Believe it or not, they were going to tear down Grand Central Station just like everything else. But there is a part in the ceiling where they still show what it looked like prior to the restoration. You take a boat tour and you see all those beautiful Victorian-style homes on both sides of the river. That's on the Canadian side and our side. How in the world did they build all those houses back in the day before power tools, or electrical tools and so forth? How'd they do it, Alex?
I mean, well, I own a stone house from 1825, and like I said the last episode, I'm actively refurbishing a bathroom right now. We literally pulled up 3 different types of flooring in order to get to the original floorboards. But every single time I walk in the basement or I'm looking at the structure, I go, how in the world? You think it would take them so long, and not to bring this up to a crazy level, but you think the same thing about the pyramids. How'd they do it? You know, people, I think it really comes down to the motivation of people. Like we've always talked about, these people saw something here. They wanted to be part of what was happening here. And they said, we have the money to do it. Let's do it.
But these days, to build a house, you have to jump through hoops to build a home these days. And now, again, they didn't have the ordinance that we had now. They didn't have the regulations in as far as how close your house could be to the edge of the island or the waterfront and so forth. Or does that hold back developers from coming up here and building the next hotel, Alex?
Yes and no. I've never been a huge fan of red tape. That's why, specifically at the town level, I think there's so much red tape out there, and some of it needs to be there. I do agree some of it needs to be there, but I've always thought, as far as our local code enforcement, our local laws and whatnot, we should be there to help people through the process as much as possible, not hinder them.
Right.
So we try to work with people as much as humanly possible. A lot of the waterfront property, like I said, in Waddington is either owned by the town or by private citizens, and they are thinking about that in the long run. I know they've thought about deed restrictions I know there's one guy, he owns, there's a road, right? And then there's probably about 500 feet of waterfront, and on the other side of the road, he owns all that land too. So he has actively thought about putting deed restrictions on any lots that he sells on the waterfront side, so that you can't have over like a 1.5 story house, so that whoever builds on the other side can still have water view and whatnot. So
smart.
I think there are certain times where, it might be like, oh, I just want to build this huge mansion like right next to the water.
Right.
But then you'd be, actively taking that away from somebody who could build a house across the road and have water view as well. So I think when you think about the greater good and the greater responsibility now, I think we have a good thought process on it. But still, at the end of the day, it takes so much to build a house nowadays. Just money wise, you know, and trying to get a contractor that's good.
And I know a couple.
And just to get the materials, like I said, over to these islands from the mainland, it's very, very difficult.
Well, the quarry for both Boldt Castle and Singer Castle were from, I want to say, Ironsides Island. And there's a rookery there for blue herons now, but they quarried a lot of stone from the actual seaway and from the islands that were close by. But again, the manpower, sawing lumber from, they probably bought sawmills out there to the islands to do all this stuff, but they had the money to do it as well. So they had some dollar bills to throw around.
Well, my house in Waddington, all the stone came from the river.
Yep.
And there are like I think there's close to 10 homes that were all built around the same time. There were Scottish masons that came up from New York City, and they built the Ogden mansion on Ogden Island. And then all the Ogden's buddies were like, hey, could you come to my house next year and build, or come to my land next year and build me a house?
Sure.
And it almost is like, if you look around and you see the stone houses in Waddington, it's like they went from here, the next year they built this one, the next year they built that one. And it's just, they were experts at their trade, and they did exactly what they were supposed to do. And they did it quick.
Did we build boats along the St. Lawrence? I mean, the boat, the antique boat museum in Clayton is historic. It's probably the best antique boat museum in the planet.
That's a big draw.
So it's a big draw, and people from all over the country who are into wooden boats, Chris Crafts and whatnot, didn't have a clue about it. But did we make boats on the St. Lawrence River?
Yeah, so in the War of 1812, every single boat that we made for the Navy was made in Ogdensburg, New York.
Wow. And not to mention Sackett's was a big area.
It was the last deep sea port. Because back then you had the rapids.
Right.
So the last place you could go before you hit the rapids from the Great Lakes was Ogdensburg. So anything, the shipping yard is right where the De La Presentation's land is now, right there. So over the years that's been contaminated with different things, but now it's finally getting to a place where they can rebuild the fort right where the lighthouse is. But a lot of the ships were built right there, put into harbor right in that last deep sea port, and then put down the river right into the Great Lakes.
It's amazing. We have a place on Point Peninsula that looks at Sackett's and Henderson Harbor from the other side of Henderson Bay, if you will. And it's just amazing to note that there was a war that took place there. And ships sank and men died.
Yeah.
And we often think that wars are somewhere else. And we had the luxury of, obviously, as a country and where we're located and our might, for that matter, we had the ability to go elsewhere to fight our wars. But other than the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and of course the Civil War, all the other wars were pretty much somewhere else. But to think that there were ships coming here from York, which is now Toronto, and that were sunk, and people didn't get back to where they originated from, that's just amazing stuff, folks. So the history here, because of the War of 1812 and everything up the river, guys, is just fantastic.
Thanks to Ancestry.com, I was able to find out that my fourth great grandfather, Benjamin Hammond, served at Sackett's Harbor.
Did he really?
Yeah, he was one of the first people to live in Henderson, not Henderson Harbor, but the town of Henderson. He's on the original roll of like the first people to live there, and that was in 1810.
Wow.
And then when the war broke out, he was mustered in with the rest of the troops. And
I know that Ulysses S. Grant did a tour there as a lieutenant.
Right,
back in the Navy.
Right across the way here is the Woodruff. Well, they call it the Woodruff Medical Building, but that's where the Woodruff Hotel was. And on the second floor, there was a balcony. It might have been the third floor, but I know Ulysses S. Grant came up here when he was president. He was president, obviously, after the Civil War in the early 1870s. But he stood there. The place was packed with people, as you can imagine, like many other presidents. When a president would be here, or a senator, like Senator or Robert Kennedy and whatnot, everyone would come down here and watch him. But he did mention his days as a lieutenant in Sackett's Harbor, right across the way from here. So we're sitting in a very historic spot for obvious reasons, but that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this area, the Thousand Islands, plus Eastern Lake Ontario, and how people gravitated here and all the history behind it. Let me ask you, Alex, you're both young guys and whatnot. What was the first historic story that you remembered growing up about the river?
For me, it would have to be the story of the Ogden family. The Ogden family came to Waddington before it was even Waddington. They owned a lot of the land up here, along with Joshua Waddington. But the story was there was this huge, huge mansion that they built on Ogden Island. And unfortunately, unlike what we've been talking about a lot today, where it was destroyed by fire. It was actually destroyed purposefully by the owner because they believed that when the seaway was built, it was going to have to be torn down anyway.
Wow.
So the worst part about that story is if you look at where the foundation is, it would have been saved.
Oh, my goodness.
It would have been fine.
It would have still been there.
It would have still been there. It was built in the late 1700s. Rumors are that I'm sure we can cover a whole episode on the tour of James Monroe when he toured around through he was touring the fortifications that we had right after the War of 1812 to make sure if there ever was another war with Canada that we were good on our northern border.
Right.
And so when he went to Plattsburgh, he took it all the way down the river by horse and buggy, just following the river, down to Sackett's Harbor. And I know for a fact he stopped and stayed at Nathaniel Ford's house, who was a colonel in Morristown. And it's rumored that he was friends with the Ogden family and stayed at the house on the island as well. So that the story, I guess it's a bunch of different stories, but we've always heard about the Ogden family. And I always thought it was funny as a kid. I go, Ogden family, Waddington,
right?
Ogdensburg,
right? Exactly.
Well, it was one of their cousins that actually was the namesake for Ogdensburg. But the David Ogden was I believe was the first member of Congress from this area in New York State to service on the federal level.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah. Josh?
Like I said, it was probably when I started visiting Singer Castle on Georgetown Island, and I remember very, very dark nights riding with a flashlight on a tiny little John boat from Chippewa Bay out to the island and seeing that castle just appear as you come around Toothpick Island. And I thought, this is just a crazy, mysterious place that I didn't even know was in my backyard growing up as real young. And just being able to see the sights and the boats go by and the freighters, I just was blown away by the size of those freighters. So that just started some kind of little nugget way down deep about there's so much to explore around here. If I had one boat, maybe not a canoe because the river gets pretty rough sometimes, but if I had a little bit larger boat, I could literally spend an entire year just making stops and doing some research, and I would just barely scrape the surface. So that just intrigued me.
Bill Johnson, I'm sure you guys heard about the famous pirate, and not to mention Pirate Days on the river. What do you want to share about him? Legendary guy.
Legendary guy. I know he was. He's quite a history. He's a caretaker of a Sunken Rock lighthouse, if I'm not mistaken, one of the lighthouses.
After he
escaped. He was the letter of the law eventually found him. He was put in prison. He escaped prison by making a key out of zinc, and I can't remember where he went ashore, but he escaped in a log. He stayed in a log for about 3 days, I think, while the authorities were looking for him, and made his way back south to the U.S.
The only reason why I know the story is because on my Robinson side, my mother's side of the family, before we came over here, we were Irish Canadian. So when the potato famine happened, we went to Canada. We didn't come through Ellis Island.
A lot of people did.
So
a lot of by way of Montreal.
Yeah. So my ancestor Abraham Robinson was actually called to arms for the Canadian side. He was part of the Canadian militia. So there were British regulars in the Canadian militia that were fighting against these it was like 100 Americans that were led by Johnston and a bunch of Canadians who were, trying to revolutionize against the crown, like we did, almost 100 years before.
Right.
And it went horribly.
It didn't go well.
I think that's when he was running from the law.
Well, I know he sacked a vessel near either Chippewa Bay or a little bit upriver. He was supposed to get like 100 conscripts, like you said, and no one showed up. So I think it was like 13 men that overtook the ship. They couldn't manage it themselves after sacking it, and they screamed out, remember the Caroline, which is a throwback to some British ship that they were trying to avenge. I know that. But they didn't have enough people to man that ship. They ended up burning it and sinking it. But that was essentially what he was on the lam for, is getting a little rebellion going, taking that ship, and in a protest to whatever happened with the Caroline. We could dig that up further. But then he was on the run.
And we talked earlier about Charles Emery, and again, if you can elaborate on that, Josh. Interesting irony in that he was a hotel builder, and he built it on Frontenac Island. And unfortunately, he heard as he was a tobacco guy, and yet the hotel burned down due to cigarette smoking.
Yeah, that's an interesting turn of fate. So for my research, they had a man named George Morse. He was attorney in Clayton. He was representing C.G. Emery. So Morse had bought a lot of properties in islands along the St. Lawrence. Ended up selling some to Charles Emery. One of those islands was Round Island. He decided to build a hotel on that island called Frontenac, and it was the place to be for the turn of the century folks that would come up here and vacation. And I think we're upwards of 5+ floors with some dormers, and it was a multi-million-dollar hotel. And Charles Emery stemmed from the American Tobacco Company. In a strange twist of fate or irony, one of the helpers or one of the staff was smoking and didn't extinguish a cigarette in the hotel in one of the wings and ended up burning the entire place down by way of a cigarette. So you just can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't.
Just can't.
But what's fascinating, one thing we didn't talk about is Fineview, the small community right there on Wellesley Island.
Very nice place.
Very famous people obviously live there, including Abby Hoffman, who was he changed his real name was Barry Freed. His last name was Freed. It escapes me at the moment, but nonetheless, he was a radical during the '60s, and he kind of went into oblivion. But he lived with a model, beautiful woman up there in Fineview. If you've ever been to Fineview, and I know you have been. Is that the closest thing to a story town, Josh, than you've ever seen before? It's amazing.
Best way to describe it is pastel-colored houses with
beautiful
canvas on their porches. And if I ever do an outside sitting porch, I'm definitely going to cover it in canvas and make it like a 3 Seasons room. But it's just its own little place, and there's golf carts everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere.
Just quaint little place on the head of Wellesley Island. So I definitely check it out if you're in the area.
Yeah, and it had the common in the middle, and like you said before about the new gazebo there in Waddington, they have a very sizable gazebo there. But when you go into Fineview, I honestly feel like I'm going in a place back in time. Like I used to play a board game when I was a kid called Candyland that had that kind of ornate look to it. That's what it looks like. It looks like just like something out of March of the Wooden Soldiers, only in color, obviously.
Just so you know, I played that as a kid too. You know,
did you play Candyland? I just always assumed that board games are a thing of the past because the video games have replaced them. But that's good to know. Candyland was. Did you ever play Monopoly at all?
Yeah, yeah. I've actually got a Beatles Monopoly game.
A Beatles Monopoly game.
Yeah.
I know they also adapted Monopoly to the township. I'm sure Watertown had its own Monopoly game,
right.
Which trade now they're changing things over to be politically correct, but we won't get into it.
Not a bad idea for the St. Lawrence Seaway Monopoly game.
Hey.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea, considering all the movers and shakers that we had. Is there a famous cemetery for all the famous people that lived there, or is in fact all the people that made big waves, if you will, as seasonal residents there, were they buried somewhere else where they lived for the most part throughout the year?
The only thing I can think of right now that kind of would bring all the things we've kind of been talking about together. Jane Fonda's mother.
Yeah.
Spent the last few years of her life in the psychiatric center in Ogdensburg. And she was buried in Ogdensburg. So I believe, Henry Fonda would have been her husband, Peter and Jane, their kids.
Right.
If I recall,
it's amazing you know that, Alex.
Yes. Is she in an unmarked grave across the street? Is that the one I'm thinking?
I don't believe she's unmarked.
Okay.
Because her daughter, Jane, whenever she comes, she goes to the same bed and breakfast. And this was in the news a few years ago when she came and visited her, because I think she comes every year to do flowers.
Right.
And the bed and breakfast guy keeps his mouth shut. And she comes, does her thing, stays for a couple nights, leaves, and then it's in the news 2 days after she's already left. That's the way she likes it.
She's gone before anyone knew it.
Yep.
It's amazing. I've often felt, again, we talked about this area being non-judgmental. Wade Boggs came up to Clayton about maybe 15, 16 years ago, famous baseball player and all. He went to the Clipper Inn, famous, right there on Route 12. One of the best restaurants, probably in the whole state.
Sponsored.
Yeah, exactly. So he was there with his family, and he told the waitress after all was said and done, he says, "Hey, thanks for not drawing any attention to me," because obviously someone was, "Hey, can I get your autograph?" and would draw attention to, "Hey, Wade Boggs is here." So he appreciated the fact that she didn't do that. Of course, she didn't know who he was. Again, that's a typical example. And even if she did, I just think that when it comes down to it, when celebrities up here, we have Viggo Mortensen from the area, Richard Grieco, with so many other people that have lived here at one time or another. But we don't seem to be fazed by celebrities up here. Do you ever see that, Josh?
So many new faces coming through the area that you just go about your day, and people like to be left alone. But there's also so many places to hide up here. If you have a boat that's navigable and can get with a shallow draft into some of these spots in the river, you could hide from anybody.
Right.
And that makes the smuggling and the drug moving pretty significant too.
It did, yeah.
But I think that also resonates when people from the North Country go to different places. Perfect example. I was walking with my family probably close to 7 years ago in Central Park, right? And we were going to take a picture in front of the famous eatery there, Tavern on the Green.
Yeah, sure.
And so, of course, we have 3 people in my family. My mom's like, oh, you 3 go, 4 people in my family. My mom's like, oh, you guys, I'll take the picture, you know? And this guy is sitting there reading a book, and he goes, oh, I'll take the picture for you. And my mom's like, no, it's fine. It's fine. I go, Mom, do you know who that is? She's like, no. And I still to this day don't know what his name is. He if you saw him, he's in so many movies. But anyway, he was the guy who was asking, hey, can I take your picture or whatever? And I go, Dad, that's that guy I'm all about.
Wow.
Right? And my dad goes, oh, all right. And my dad just walked up to him and said, have I seen you somewhere before? And the guy goes, I don't know, maybe. He goes, I like your movies. Shook his hand and we just walked away. You know, it wasn't like, oh, can we take a picture with you or whatever? And the ironic thing was the guy was asking us if we needed him to take a picture of our family, you know? But I think it transcends. I think it's just the same type of thing we were talking about the last episode. People up here just, you know, we want to help people who are coming through, and we want to let them have a good experience while they are here.
Oh, wait, before we move on, we're going to find out it was Delroy Linda.
You've seen that guy.
I have seen that guy too. Is he the guy that does the Arby's commercials? So no, but what I'm saying is there has been major investment. But do you see from both your vantage points, guys? Do you see new investments coming this way? Is Marriott planning on building a hotel? There was talks about that years ago. Does the Hilton family have any interest up here? Is there any means of building the next Frontenac hotel on the St. Lawrence River, Josh?
I think it's an interesting concept, but I almost would be more interested in having the local businessmen and businesswomen establish those places to go stay and to have fun. And the people that are from here and the local populace would almost be better suited to put those kind of events on and welcome those people. Build those hotels, maybe.
I agree.
The experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I think is so cool about an island, you can almost create in a whole nother world, right? Just something I've thought about in daydreams, right?
Yeah.
I would love to rebuild the mansion on Ogden Island, but rebuild it even bigger and make it a hotel. And then on that 3 miles of island, have a 36-hole golf course. And I've always thought if there was some type of wood boat service that would take you from the mainland over, you know, and of course this is, you know, not, you know, 16-year-old Alex thinking this, right? You know, you had to wear a tuxedo, you know, type of stuff like that to be in the ballroom.
Right.
But this was the thing; it would still be affordable, so that the common guy could take his son golfing on the island, an international golf course, create that world where they could feel fancy and feel served and feel, you know, for a day, you know, and still have it not hurt the bank, you know?
Well, first of all, Wellesley Island has 3 golf courses. Beautiful. And if you go, and they're beautiful, because there's one municipal, there's the 19-hole golf course there, and of course there's the TI Club. But if you go downstream, you go to was it Sandy Islands? Or is it Stoney Islands? Excuse me, which is what you see off Henderson. You see Galoo, and believe it or not, from space, or at least from Google Maps, you could see what was a 9-hole golf course, and it was owned by Phillips 66 or some oil company owned it, and they still do, I believe. But just you'll see these islands, you figure there's just nothing else other than snakes and birds and whatnot. But people really establish them as not only for their homes, but they put golf courses on them. We couldn't do that today.
It's a great effort for unimproved, large, grassy islands. That's a great idea. So for the hotels, you wouldn't have to recreate the entire size of that hotel. Say, for instance, the one on the Frontenac Hotel on Round Island. Maybe a smaller, miniature version of that, just a throwback to make it mirror that. But the space is there. Some people have these cottages that almost look like humongous hotels and sprawling spaces, but that's half the fun, is to get in the boat and drive around and see what sprawling complexes these people have built on tiny little rock outcroppages. And I think they have Peach Island is out near Crossover Island, so big stretch of river. It's I believe it's the only man-made island on the Seaway, and other than Sunken Rock Lighthouse that they brought in some stuff to build up so they could be used as an operating lighthouse. But people just will build right out to the edges of that water and the rock just peering over, and a swift gale might knock it right over into the water. But they use all that available space, and I don't think there's much real estate that's not been developed. But yeah.
What's the running joke on the Uncle Sam's boat tour? Is that little tiny house that's
mother-in-law?
The mother, yeah. And then Boldt Castle, and then George built this for his mother-in-law. And it's literally like water slapping the side of the cottage.
And by the way, when my mom went up there back in the 90s, she didn't appreciate that. It's funny how women are just very tested, because a woman is a mother-in-law to some degree, so they feel like it's a joke against themselves. But mother-in-laws get the bad end of the stick. There's no doubt about it. You guys are young guys. And it's amazing how much you do know about history. And as you get older, you're going to learn a lot more about it. So we have to keep this going, obviously. There's been books written about Watertown. There's been books written about the Thousand Islands, pictorial books, something that you'd see on a coffee table and whatnot. That's all fine and dandy. But should we enter the realm of adding this to the curriculum to our local schools about the history of our area, particularly the Thousand Islands, Alex?
I've always thought that local history should be part of the curriculum. The problem is, the more that the state gets involved with what you're supposed to do with regencies and whatnot, it doesn't allow for that to be, it's not testable information. So the teacher isn't going to teach something that isn't testable, right?
Right.
I've always thought local history should be part of the curriculum, because it's so important to know not only where you live, but kind of what you came from, what you came up in, and knowing that you're also part of that history.
Big time. Yeah. Even if you're a transplant, even if you're not, like myself. But the paper industry up here, just the names. Knowlton is the longest existing, or oldest operating, I should say, paper mill in the world, and it's right there in Factory Street. Started in 1805, and it's been making paper products since, which is incredible. But it's the same thing with Thousand Islands. It's the same thing with Jefferson County. And for that matter, you look at other parts of the state where, the Adirondacks had their heyday. And, we mentioned earlier, Lake Placid is seeing some ups and downs as well. But it's a Northeast issue. And it's as things get older homes, people start gravitating to other areas, particularly before COVID. But I'm going to be very optimistic, guys. COVID was a horrible thing. Over 500,000 people died in this country alone, millions around the world. It was a 100-year pandemic. But at the end of the day, we're going to see a resurgence of more and more people living in the region. Instead of going to Europe, instead of going to Arizona or wherever for their family vacay, they might put the money right back here. So you see that yourself, Josh.
Yes, I think people in the North Country, it's either a mixture of maple syrup or something in their blood that doesn't allow them to be down south for too long. No, you just get too hot.
Yeah.
So you come up here, and the benefit is in 20 minutes with a canoe rack, you can go hit the river or the inland lakes. It's just getting the word out there that people know that that's available to them. Like I said, 20 minutes and you are at a boat launch or at a private property, or even if your boat is moored on a dock on the river, and you take 3 hours to barrel up and down the river, you're going to see so many sights. So it's all there at your fingertips. You just have to go start the engine and go.
Right. And we often talk about jobs and industries that come up here, but tourism is a huge industry. So the more and more people that would come up here between May and October, that would just create more jobs and more hotels. Again, being optimistic. Alex, what are your thoughts?
I like to look at history to show what's going to happen in the future. I mean, we're talking about 100-year pandemic, right? When was the last pandemic?
1917, 1918.
Yeah. The Roaring 20s.
Yeah.
What did we just talk about? All these people that came up here and built these houses.
Interesting.
And all this stuff, right?
Very interesting.
Think about before that, when the Adirondacks had their big thing. There's the panic of, 1893? That's like the pre-depression, the thing that was basically like, hey, we're going to have a depression in a few years.
Roswell Flower helped Wall Street out big time. He gave millions of dollars to get him out of it.
Exactly. From J.P. Morgan, same, it's these things that, out of chaos. World War II. Oh, my God.
Yeah.
After World War II, we had the 50s.
Right.
Elvis Presley. All this stuff, so
huge expansion in America.
I think we're gonna really benefit from this bounce back. And like I said, I look to the history, I look to the past for what we can expect in the future, and that's why we study it.
Yeah. And by the way, this is happening because you talk to any realtor. Vicky Stay was here a couple of weeks ago, and she's saying great things, and it's happening everywhere, not just on the river, because you think, oh, the river's going to be first. But there's homes right here in Watertown. And I asked the question, so who's buying all these homes? I'm just curious because, in sales all my life, I just would like to know. And it's just people, downsizing or upgrading or moving on to other opportunities. But a lot of people are coming from other regions. And like you said, and both of you guys can agree, there's something in the blood of a Northeastern person that it's really nice to go to the other side of the fence. That could be Tennessee, the Carolinas, a lot of Carolina, a lot of natives of rather northern New York moving down there. But it seems like they're slowly but surely coming back up here. So, which is great because our greatest resource are our kids. We've heard that a million times. It's very cliche, but we have the best school system in the planet. There's no question. Up here, you see the facilities. I just did a football game yesterday at Carthage, a synthetic field, the lights, all of that. Your taxpayers' dollars are going towards a great cause. But it's just, you hate to see this exodus of a kid graduating either high school or college and not staying here. So, but you guys have, Alex, you stayed here.
Well, here's what I actually did some extensive work with the IDA, the Industrial Development Agency up in St. Lawrence County. And what we were trying to figure out was how do we get people to come here and how do we get people to come back here?
Right.
People who have moved away. Because, for a long time, I've heard this phrase, our biggest export in the North Country is our youth, right? Well, after doing some more studying, we actually want to export our youth. We want to export the people who are coming out of high school. But you got to look at what we're getting in return. About 10 years down the road, when they're hitting their early 30s, and they've been in the urban areas for, about a decade, they're going to have that natural want to either come back home or come back to a place like they grew up,
right?
If they enjoyed the time that they did here,
right?
In order to raise their own families. So, yes, we're exporting our youth. I think it's good to, because guess what? We're losing someone who has the equivalent of a high school degree.
Right.
When that 30-year-old's coming back, they were getting a 30-year-old with 10 years experience, a bachelor's degree, maybe a master's degree, and is going to do something and be productive in society up here.
I've never heard it that way, Alex. So you're saying that it's a good thing for someone to sow their wild oats, so to speak, go elsewhere and come back when the fruits of their rewards are what they've learned elsewhere, and they come back with all that.
And they come back with capital.
Right.
They come back with something, and guess what? They've been living in the city for the last 10 years. They're used to spending a certain amount of money on regular things. They come back up here, they're like, oh my God, this is so cheap.
And that's the trend now. Yeah. Especially due to COVID. People are leaving those built-up areas.
Yeah.
It's called the brain gain.
Brain gain. Is that the actual term, brain gain?
So there's a professor. His name is Winchester, I remember because of the rifle. Ben Winchester. He's out of, I believe, University of Wisconsin. He actually came up here to the North Country Symposium 2 years ago. It was part of my job at the IDA to find this guy and bring him up here to give a talk about it, to like amp people up about this stuff. And everyone's always talking about the brain drain because all their kids are graduating, going off to school, and they're not coming back.
Right.
Well, he found, statistically speaking, that if you look down where and when these people are returning back to places like their homes or to their homes, is in that early 30 stage where they've found, a wife or girlfriend, had their first kid, have some capital, and they're looking to go back to a place to be able to raise their kids that isn't, downtown Manhattan.
Fantastic. Again, that is perhaps the most optimistic thing I've ever heard in my life, because typically you hear anyone that leaves, they leave and they don't come back. But in essence, they do come back, but they come back much more well-rounded, if you will.
The issue is we have to find a way to get them to come back here. Right. A lot of people are choosing Vermont, places that are like here, but, have been, these other places have found a very good way of giving themselves if you want a rural life, and a good life, come to Vermont. Well, how do we become the poor person's Vermont? Right. Or a version of that.
And it's interesting because the dynamics between Vermont and New Hampshire, live free or die, and just play hacky sack. It's funny how those they coexist together like that. Well, we've been talking about the history. We went off the river, if you will, the beaten trail, which way you want to look at it. But that's what it's all about, because once you have a discussion about anything, I'm 58 years old. You guys are in your 20s, and you bring up a lot. Are you both in your?
I'm nearly 40.
You're nearly 40. Well, you look like you're in your 20s. I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. That was a compliment. But you're young guys. There's no question. Just like the guy who owns this place.
Yes.
The young blood, the young spirit is what we need, and your family men and whatnot. And that's what it's all about. I know, again, that's just a passive way of saying you guys are great and whatnot.
There was a guy I ran into 3 years ago, Princeton grad.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, I just wanted a place to raise my family. And I stumbled upon the North Country. And now I own, he's like, I could never have bought a house from the 1850s that is pretty refurbishable, but still able to keep the history, because he's a history nerd, right? Just like me. And he's like, I could have never found something like this in downtown Manhattan. It would have been knocked down 100 years ago, or even where I'm from in New Haven, So it's like he's able to bring the capital and the intellectual wisdom that he has made.
So they're coming back all over the place. Other people's despair, if you will, because a lot of cities are under turmoil right now. That's their own doing, in my opinion. But we benefit from that, guys, and that's hopefully that will continue here.
Like we said, hopefully in the near to far-reaching future, taxes will stay manageable.
Yeah, right.
And the trend is towards a gig economy, so you could be geographically independent, work on your little tiny house on an island somewhere,
right,
and upload all the work that you need to be doing to your employer, or if you're self-employed, you could be anywhere you want to be.
Yeah, and we're going to get more internet, apparently, thanks to Congress. So there is yeah, exactly, more and more, and we need it, because believe it or not, there are certain areas you can't even use a cell phone up here, which is awful. Thanks, guys. And that was our second episode of Living and Writing on the St. Lawrence River. I'm Glenn Curry for Josh Todd and Alex Hammond. Thanks again, guys, for another great episode. And we'll see you soon, everybody.